You'll want to sign this before the invitations go out." Diana Whitfield set the folder down next to my wine glass like she was passing the bread basket. We hadn't even ordered appetizers yet. I looked at Nate. He was studying his menu very closely. "It's just standard," Diana said. "Every family does this." I opened the folder. 12 pages. My name spelled wrong on the cover page, Claire Doland instead of Dolan, like she hadn't bothered to check before having her lawyer draft it. "I'll have my attorney look at it," I said. "Of course." She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is over. "No rush, just before June." The wedding was in June. This was February. 2 weeks later, Diana called me directly for the first time in the 8 months I'd known her. Not about the wedding, about a loan. $40,000, she said, just to bridge a gap until a deal closed. She'd pay it back with interest. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by asking. I told her I'd think about it. What she didn't know was that I already had $40,000 committed to something else. Something with her name on it, just not the way she expected. Before I get into how we got here, if you're enjoying the story so far, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. It really helps support the channel, and subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. Okay. Back to the beginning. My name is Claire. I'm 32. And to understand why a prenup and a phone call felt like the opening moves of something bigger, I need to take you back almost 2 years, to before I'd even met Nate. I run a company called Hawthorne Property Group. Small firm, 6 employees, one very good structural engineer I poached from a competitor, and a reputation in a fairly narrow world historic building acquisition and adaptive reuse. We buy old warehouses, old schoolhouses, old bank buildings that nobody wants to deal with because the permitting is a nightmare, and we turn them into things people actually want to live and work in. I don't use my own name for the company. That wasn't some elaborate plan. When I started Hawthorne 6 years ago, I was 26, broke, and convinced nobody would take a loan application seriously from a 26-year-old woman named Claire Dolan. So I named it after the street I grew up on. Hawthorne stuck. By the time it mattered, it was just the name of the company, and I never bothered explaining the backstory to people who didn't ask. Nate never asked. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party. He worked works and acquisitions for his family's company, Whitfield Development. Bigger firm than mine. A lot bigger. Commercial towers, retail complexes, the kind of projects that get a press release. He was funny that night, self-deprecating in a way that men in his position usually aren't, and when I told him I did consulting work in commercial real estate, he didn't ask a single follow-up question. He talked about his job for 20 minutes and never once turned it back around to mine. I noticed that. I told myself it didn't mean anything. For the first few months, it didn't. Nate was easy to be around. He remembered things I mentioned once. He showed up early. His mother I only heard about in passing, a formidable woman, he said, hard to impress, but fair once you earned it. I met Diana for the first time at a dinner Nate set up 4 months in. She shook my hand, looked me over the way you'd assess a used car, and asked what I did. "Commercial real estate," I said. "Small-scale acquisitions." "How small?" "Small enough that you've probably never heard of us." She laughed, not unkindly, and changed the subject to Nate's cousin's new baby. I remember feeling relieved. I remember thinking that had gone fine. It took me a while to understand that fine was Diana's version of dismissal. The small things started after Nate proposed. At the engagement party, her house, her guest list, her florist, Diana introduced me to a room of 40 people as Nathaniel's fiancé, who does something with old buildings. Not my name, not my company. Something with old buildings said the way you'd describe a hobby. I let it go. People misspeak at parties. Then it was the venue. I'd found a place, an old train depot 2 counties over, restored, exposed brick, the kind of space I would have wanted to buy myself if it weren't already spoken for. Diana toured it with us and said, quietly to Nate, not to me, "It's very rustic. Are you sure this is the image you want?" The image you want, not the venue we liked. The image, we ended up at the country club instead. I didn't fight it. I told myself the venue didn't matter, that I was marrying Nate, not his mother, and that some things weren't worth the argument. Then it was the guest list, which Diana revised twice without telling me, cutting 2 of my college friends to make room for business associates of Whitfield Development. Because, as she put it, this is as much a networking event as it is a wedding, whether we like it or not. Then it was the dress fitting, which she attended uninvited and spent the entire hour suggesting alterations that would make the dress, in her words, less severe. Every individual thing was small enough to swallow. That was the pattern. Nothing was ever big enough on its own to justify making a scene about it, and by the time I noticed how many small things had piled up, I'd already swallowed most of them. Nate noticed some of it, not all of it. "She means well," he said, after the venue thing. "She just has opinions. She overruled us. She didn't overrule us. She made a suggestion, and I agreed it made sense." That was the first time I understood something about Nate that I'd keep relearning for the rest of the year. When it came to his mother, he didn't defend me so much as he explained her. As if understanding Diana's reasoning was supposed to make it easier to accept. I told myself it would get better once we were married. That Diana's involvement would taper off once the wedding wasn't the thing to manage. I believed that the way you believe things you want to be true. The prenup showed up at the engagement dinner in February, 4 months before the wedding. I want to be clear about what bothered me. It wasn't the concept. I understood why a family with Diana's kind of money would want one, and honestly, I'd been planning to suggest something similar myself to protect Hawthorne. Prenups are common. Reasonable people use them. What bothered me was the delivery. The way it was handed to me at a restaurant table before we'd ordered, like a formality she expected me to sign without reading. The misspelled name. The fact that Nate had known it was coming. I found that out later and hadn't warned me. I read it that night at home. It wasn't just a standard asset protection document. Clause 7 capped any claim I could make on marital property acquired during the marriage at a fixed amount, regardless of how long we were married or what I contributed. Clause 11 required me to sign a non-disparagement agreement regarding the Whitfield family, enforceable even after divorce. It read less like a prenup and more like a document written by someone who had already decided what kind of person I was. I had my attorney review it. She called it aggressive and not typical for a relationship of this length. I asked Nate about it. "That's just how my mom's lawyer drafts things," he said. "We can negotiate the terms." "I'm not upset about negotiating terms. I'm upset it reads like she thinks I'm after your family's money." Nate didn't say anything for a second too long. "She's been burned before," he finally said. "My uncle's second wife took him for a lot in the divorce. It's not about you specifically." I wanted to believe that. I mostly didn't. 2 weeks later, Diana called me, not Nate, me. "Claire, I hate to ask this," she said, in a tone that didn't sound like hating to ask anything, "but we've hit a cash flow gap on a project, and I was hoping you might be able to help bridge it. 40,000. It would come back to you with interest, obviously, once the deal closes." I asked, "What deal?" "An acquisition downtown. Nothing you know about. Older building, needs to move fast." I told her I'd think about it. I didn't ask which building. I already had a guess, because I'd been tracking a bid on an old freight depot downtown for 3 months, and I knew exactly how tight the timeline was, because I was the one who'd made the offer that put the seller in a hurry. Here's what I hadn't told Nate, and definitely hadn't told Diana. 8 weeks before that phone call, Hawthorne Property Group had submitted a sealed bid on a building called the Kessler Freight Depot. 14,000 square feet, built in 1911, sitting empty for 6 years because the previous owner couldn't get the permits sorted and ran out of money trying. I'd wanted that building since I first walked through it 18 months earlier. The seller had rejected 2 lowball offers from developers who wanted to tear out the original ironwork and turn it into generic loft condos. I made an offer that kept the structure intact and proposed mixed-use retail and office space, which is what I actually build. My bid was under a business name the seller's broker knew as Hawthorne, not Claire Dolan, not anything connected on paper to a woman engaged to Nathaniel Whitfield. The seller accepted my offer in principle in January. We were in the exclusivity period, finalizing financing, 3 weeks from a signed contract. I didn't think about who else might be bidding. I had no reason to, until Diana asked me for $40,000 to help bridge a gap on an acquisition downtown with a timeline that sounded exactly like a company trying to beat someone else to a signed contract. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything to Nate either. Partly because I wasn't certain yet. Partly because some instinct told me to wait and see how this actually played out before I handed anyone a reason to get ahead of it. What I didn't know yet was that Diana had already told half the family the deal was basically done. I found that out 3 weeks later, at what was supposed to be a routine Sunday dinner at the Whitfield house. Nate's aunt asked Diana how the depot project was coming along, and Diana lit up in a way I'd never seen her light up about anything involving me. "We're closing in 2 weeks," she said. "It's going to be the anchor of the whole revitalization push downtown. Whitfield Development restoring a piece of the city's history." She said it like a headline she'd already written. "I thought that fell through," Nate's aunt said. "Didn't someone else have it under contract?" "There was some other offer, but it's not going anywhere," Diana said. "Our lawyer's handling it. The current buyer doesn't have the capital to actually close. These small operators bite off more than they can chew all the time." I sat there with a glass of wine in my hand and didn't say a word. She had no idea the small operator was sitting across the table from her, eating the pot roast her housekeeper made. That was when I started paying closer attention, because until that dinner, I genuinely believed there might be some overlap. I was misreading some other building, some coincidence. After that dinner, I knew exactly what was happening. Diana Whitfield was trying to outbid me on a building I already had under contract, using information she didn't know she was leaking to me every time she talked about it. I called my attorney the next morning and asked her to check the closing timeline again. Solid. Nothing had fallen through. We were still on track to close in 19 days. Whatever Diana thought was happening on her end, she was wrong about the current buyer not having the capital, because the current buyer was me, and I had the capital, because I'd spent 6 years building a company specifically so that when a building like this came along, I wouldn't need anyone's permission to buy it. I thought about telling Nate. I got as far as sitting across from him at dinner one night, the words half formed, before I stopped myself. Not because I wanted to hide it from him forever. Because I wanted to see what he'd do once he knew, and some part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, but couldn't talk myself out of, wanted to see whether Diana would find out on her own before I ever had to say anything. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about it a lot since. I wasn't holding on to the information as a weapon. I was holding on to it because for the first time since we got engaged, I had something in this relationship that was entirely mine, that Diana couldn't touch, revise, or explain away, and I wasn't ready to hand that over yet. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday. Diana's final offer, the one she needed my $40,000 to help fund, which I never gave her, and which I later learned she'd cobbled together from a bridge loan instead, was due to the seller's broker the same week. She didn't know that. She thought she had more time. I signed the closing documents for the Kessler Freight Depot on a Tuesday morning in my attorney's office under the name of Hawthorne Property Group, LLC, with my name, Claire Dolan, spelled correctly, listed as managing member and sole owner. 2 days later, Whitfield Development's revised offer landed on the seller's broker's desk. Too late. The broker called Diana's office to let her know the property had already closed, to a buyer who wished to remain unnamed pending the announcement of their renovation plans. I didn't find out how that call went, but I found out what happened next, because it happened at the rehearsal dinner 4 days later, in front of both families. Diana stood up to give a toast. She'd been planning it for weeks. Nate told me something about welcoming me into the family, about the Whitfield legacy, about the exciting things ahead for the family business. She got about 2 sentences into the toast, something about how proud she was of Nate's work downtown, about the depot project representing everything Whitfield Development stood for when Nate's cousin, the one who worked in commercial leasing and had clearly heard something Diana hadn't caught up on yet, said, not unkindly, "Wait, I thought that fell through. I heard Hawthorne closed on it Tuesday." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when nobody knows if something is supposed to be a secret. Diana's smile didn't move, but her eyes did. "I'm sure that's not right. I do leasing for a firm 2 blocks from there," the cousin said. "It was in the broker update this morning. Hawthorne Property Group, some boutique firm. They're already filing renovation permits." Diana looked at me. I don't know what she expected to see. I didn't say anything right away, because for a second I genuinely didn't know what to say, and because some petty, exhausted part of me wanted to let the silence sit there a little longer. "Claire," Nate said slowly, "you work in commercial real estate. Do you know anything about this firm?" I set down my fork. "I own it," I said. I'm not going to pretend the rest of that dinner was graceful. It wasn't. Diana asked me to repeat myself, which I did. Nate asked why I hadn't told him. I told him the truth, that I'd found out his mother was trying to outbid me before I even had a chance to mention it casually, and that after that, I genuinely didn't know how to bring it up without it becoming exactly the scene it had just become. Diana didn't yell. That wasn't her style. She got very quiet, the way people get quiet when they're recalculating a lot of things at once, and asked to speak to Nate privately. I let them go. I sat at the table with both sets of parents and a rehearsal dinner cake nobody was touching, and I answered the questions people were too polite not to ask. Yes, I'd owned Hawthorne for 6 years. Yes, I'd bid on the depot months before Diana knew I existed as a business owner. No, I hadn't done it to spite anyone. I'd wanted that building since before Nate and I met. The $40,000 came up eventually. Nate's father asked, half joking, whether I'd considered just lending Diana the money and letting her figure it out. I told him I hadn't seriously considered it, because I didn't think it was my job to help outbid myself. Nobody laughed, but nobody argued with the logic either. Nate and I didn't call off the wedding that night. I want to say that plainly, because I know how these stories usually end, and this one didn't end with a dramatic scene where I hand back the ring. What happened was slower and, honestly, harder to explain in one sentence. Nate came to me 2 days later and said he understood why I hadn't told him. He also said something that stuck with me longer than I expected. That watching his mother find out in front of everyone made him realize how much energy he'd spent, for years, managing information so Diana wouldn't be upset, and that he hadn't noticed he was doing the same thing in our relationship until he watched me do the opposite. I told him I hadn't handled it perfectly either. I hadn't. Sitting on that information for weeks wasn't honest, even if I understood why I'd done it. We didn't fix everything in that conversation. Diana didn't apologize, not really. What she offered, 3 weeks later, over a stiff lunch she requested, was closer to an acknowledgement that she'd underestimated me, delivered in a tone that made it sound like a compliment I hadn't earned the right to hear yet. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I didn't tell her I forgave her because I wasn't sure yet if I did. The wedding didn't happen in June. We postponed it, not called off, postponed, which is a distinction that mattered a lot to both of us at the time and still does. Nate and I are still together as I'm telling you this. We're not engaged anymore, not exactly, though the ring is still in a drawer neither of us has done anything about. Diana and I are civil. We're not close, and I don't think we ever will be, but she stopped handing me documents at dinner tables, and I stopped waiting for her to prove herself before I trusted her with anything. The Kessler Freight Depot is finished now. Mixed use, exactly the way I pitched it, original ironwork intact, 6 retail units, offices upstairs. It's the best project Hawthorne has ever done. Ironically, Whitfield Development leases office space 2 blocks away, and I've heard, secondhand, that Diana tells people the depot would have been a good fit for our portfolio too. I let her have that version. It costs me nothing. The thing that stayed with me longest wasn't the money, or the building, or even the toast that fell apart in real time in front of 40 people. It was realizing how long I'd been making myself smaller in small, deniable ways. A venue here, a guest list there, because I thought that was the price of being welcomed into a family that had already decided who I was before they bothered to ask. Diana Whitfield spent months trying to find out what kind of person she thought I was. She never once asked what kind of business I'd built. That was the mistake. Not mine. Hers.